The Peggy Browning Fund is a nonprofit organization, and it was established in memory of Peggy Browning. And who, you will ask, is Peggy Browning? Well, she was an excellent workers' rights advocate, an attorney, also an ice dancer. And she was a member of the National Labor Relations Board, and for those of you familiar with labor law, you know that that is the entity, that the administrative agency that oversees and prosecutes cases that deal with labor law. Unfortunately, she died of cancer in 1997 at age 46, and upon her untimely death, her husband, Joe Laurie, brought together labor academics and labor attorneys to establish this fund in her name. So the purpose of the Peggy Browning Fund is that they have summer fellowships, they have a National Law Students Worker Right Conference, and they have other networking opportunities like this. When they started in 1998, they had 10 summer fellowships. Currently, in 2018, they have 80 summer fellowships, 1 school year fellowship, and they're hosting the 20th Annual National Law Students Workers' Rights Conference near Baltimore, October 12th and 13th. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chad.
All right, thank you, Professor Levinson, and thank you for Peggy Browning. So the fellowships are, like she said, there's around 80 fellowships per year across the nation. So from New York to LA, from Shining Sea. I mean, it's just, they have, like I said, New York, DC, Detroit, a lot. There's some in California. These fellowships are competitive. They're highly prestigious, and they're paid. So they're paid on a minimum of $6,000 per the 10 weeks. And of course, you got to finish the 10 weeks to obtain the full amount. And the fellowships are either at unions or worker centers, nonprofits that are advocating for workers' rights, and union side plaintiffs firms like Mr. Cutler's and Devon. Also, these fellowships really give you practical work experience. I'll tell you my experience in Dayton, Ohio at the IUE, but they give you first year associate experience and not like your typical internship experience where you're sitting behind a desk and researching on Lexis or Westlaw or whatever. You're actually practicing, so it's just amazing to be able to be in these fellowships. Also, to apply to these fellowships, you go online. It's a fairly easy process, similar to our OCIs, in which they ask you for your typical cover letter, resume, in any other documents that a particular fellowship may ask. But it's a pretty simple process, and the mentorship will, if they see your resume, they'll call you just like any other employer would do, and set up an interview, and hopefully it works out the best. In my case, it did work out. I was called by the IUECWA in Dayton, Ohio, and I did an interview with them, and it worked out, and they offered me a fellowship. And the fellowship, again, from the first day to the last day, I was really in the lines, and they gave me the associate experience that I've longed for. You know, sitting in the classroom, you're reading books, and you're just kind of like, man, I really want to get out there, and I really want to help people. And that's what they allowed me to do. I was able to question witnesses during an arbitration. I was able to write a whole entire draft that's possibly going to be distributed nationwide, that advocates for domestic abuse victims in the workplace to protect their jobs in really the hardships of being a domestic abuse victim, and also being discriminated against based on that fact. Then in another unique situation, I came across with a plant in Virginia was closing down and being out. The workers, the labor was being outsourced to India, and we immediately went down there and see what type of decision bargaining and how we could help the union members there. So overall, it was just an amazing experience. I mean, I could sit here and go on and on about it, but obviously I'm here every day. You can come to me any day of the week. You see me, just stop and I'll tell you. So I'll give it back to Professor Levinson.
And so I just want to make sure you know that the application process for those fellowships, if you're a 1L or a 2L, opens on December 1st and closes on January 18th. So you would go online to the Peggy Browning Foundation, and then you would look for the application process. So I'm full of questions, as always, those of you who know me. But I'm just going to open up some questions to all the panelists and target some of them just in the interest of time to certain panelists. So I just want to start with this overall question for all three of you about how is advocating for workers' rights involved in your job? You want to start?
You're looking at me.
Yes.
So I will start, and I'll say virtually my entire legal career has been representing unions or representing workers. And when I first started practicing, most of labor law was actually labor relations, the relations between unions and employers, or unions and their own members, rather than so much employment law. And over the years, employment law has become a bigger and bigger part of the practice of most persons who used to be union side lawyers. It's very much a part of what I do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it may be defending a worker who has been unfairly discharged without good cause, and an arbitration hearing. It may be asserting the seniority rights or vacation rights or overtime rights of employees under a union contract. And in many cases, we represent workers who are not in unions, and I use the term workers in a broad sense, not just somebody who's out working by the hour, working with his or her hands, but people who are nurses, professionals, doctors, lawyers on occasion, executives. They're all workers in a certain sense. Now, that's not the kind of thing you think of when you're talking about social justice, but people who are middle class and above also are entitled to good and vigorous representation when they're dealing with someone who has even more power than they do, their employer. So those issues could involve termination agreements, termination of employments, discrimination, based upon some invidious classifications, which we all know, and other instances of unfair treatment on the job. I could elaborate forever, but we've got a lot of questions and a lot of panelists.
Well, Buddy's pretty much summed up exactly my practice area as well. While we are in different firms, my practice really does parallel what Buddy has already spoken with you about. So rather than take up more time explaining further what I do want to stress to you what's already sort of been said by Chad, but really to tell you that for attorneys that are starting out going into whatever type of public interest law that you can get your foot in the door to go into is invaluable experience. Public interest jobs are hard to come by, but if you actually get your foot in the door, you're going to learn skills that you wouldn't learn by first starting out at a bigger firm. I started out at the public defender's office, and what better way to jump in, get your feet wet, get a client on your first day, well, multiple clients, as Brandon knows, than to go to the public defender's office. And so starting there, my first day, I'm sitting across from someone that's charged with a crime. If you're at a big firm, you don't do that. You don't get any on-the-ground client experience until probably your 6th, 7th year if you're lucky. So labor law is sort of a part of public interest law in that you're really focused on individuals, and you do have the opportunity as a younger associate to have experiences like Chad has had, and you get them from the beginning. So for all of you, I would encourage you to really look at this field as a great way to get your feet in the door, and also to help people from day one.
I would start by saying part of the reason I went to law school is because I actually wanted to be an employment lawyer. And I wanted to practice employment law because employment law, to me, is very important. If you think about it, you spend at least, and in many cases more time, 40 hours a week if you're a full-time employee. So you spend a lot of time with management, you spend a lot of time with your supervisors, you spend a lot of time with your coworkers. So those relationships become very important over time. And then also, aside from that, as you guys know, because you want to be lawyers, part of what a person does become part of their identity as well. So it's something very important to the person as the client that you're going to end up representing if you choose to do employment law. So once I began, I was at the public defender's office and I was representing criminal clients charged with criminal acts. And it was very different, but the one thing that remains the same is you have someone who's asking for your help. And as lawyers, your job is to try to find the help or find the solution. And employment law works largely the same way. When I take in a case, I do an intake, I try to see what issues are there, because some people know there's something not right, but they may not know how to handle it. So part of my job is to whittle it down and say, okay, this is a claim I think you should file. The other claim is really not a viable claim. And I think that's ultimately what you end up doing when you practice employment law, because a lot of things, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess if you're the lawyer, happen on a day-to-day basis to employees every day. And sometimes it's horrible things that you can't, even as a lawyer, do anything about. But often there are a lot of things that you can do something about. So I think part of it is just learning the client's story. And that's what I do in my practice day-to-day.
So to add that these fellowships, I mean, that's your foot in the door. So as an aspiring labor attorney, you know, that's what I came to law school. I want to be a labor attorney. I want to represent the employees. And so to be able to gain that experience or get that foot in the door and keep the foot in the door upon, you know, graduation is very crucial. And as far as like throughout my fellowship and the experiences I was doing, the advocating, I see the client as it really just, I want to put as much passion as I can for their client to either get their job back or get benefits. So, I mean, sometimes I see that I'm advocating for the future employees, not only that particular client. So I have 3 children, and I'm advocating for their workers' rights, not only the present, but again, the future. So it's just really important to me, like Brandon said, I mean, at a full-time job, essentially you're seeing your boss or your coworkers more than you see your family. And so it's just really important field of law.
Fantastic. So Brandon told us a little bit about why he went to this field, and so I was wondering, Devon, if you could tell us a little bit about why you went into this field of workers' rights and how you ended up there after the public defender.
Sure, I would love to. I actually started my career as a professional harpist. I played harp since the age of 8, and I majored in music when I went to college. I knew when I went to college I got a wonderful piece of advice from my harp teacher that I had growing up, and she said, if you can imagine yourself doing anything other than playing the harp all the time, then do that, because you don't want to be a musician. And I said, great, let's figure out something else to do. So this wonderful woman that gave me this advice at the time was a professional harpist. She was in a symphony where I grew up, and she was going through some really nasty contract negotiations. I started talking to her about the contract negotiations she was going through. So professional musicians, if they're in an orchestra, they're covered generally under a collective bargaining agreement, which is an agreement that's formed between the musicians and management. So I was constantly asking her what's going on with the negotiations. Do you know? Are you getting any concessions? Are you getting benefits? What's going on? And her response over and over again was, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Nobody's communicating with me. I'm not sure. And I realized that I wanted to do something to be able to help her. And so I decided to go to law school. So I actually went to law school with the intention of hopefully one day, if I could eventually get my foot in the door, of practicing the exact type of law that I do right now, which is labor relations law, where I could answer the questions that she had. So instead of her or other musicians, other workers coming to me and saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I could actually be the person to provide those responses and ensure in the future that workers and musicians like herself would not be in that position again.
So did you see the job opening at your current firm when you were at Public Defenders?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I started when I was in law school, my third year of law school. I went to University of Cincinnati, not terribly far from here. And I'm not sure if you all have something similar, but we had a great opportunity to be able to actually go and work for an organization that supported the Public Defender's Office. So I started out my third year actually representing clients with a limited license through this organization. So because of the training that I already had, and because I have some members of my family that are attorneys, they said, look, if you can get a job at the PD's office, instead of going straight into labor law, take the job at the PD's office because you're going to get even more courtroom experience, client experience than you would otherwise. And I kept saying, no, I don't want to do that. That's not why I went to law school. Why are you people telling me this? And the response I continued to get was, just do it. Just do it. Okay, great. So I ended up at the Public Defender's Office. I knew it was probably not going to be my life's work to be a public defender, but I went, I served my time, I got my on-the-ground training, and while I was at the Public Defender's Office, I kept talking to people, I kept networking with people, thinking, okay, when the time is right, I'll make my transition into private practice, hopefully in labor and employment. So I ended up leaving the Public Defender's Office. I had some family issues going on, so it wasn't possible for me to continue at the PD's office with the hours that I needed to work. While I was transitioning out, I met my current boss, Dave Suholtz. We had an initial meeting, I think, over coffee, and he said, okay, great, I'll keep you in mind. There wasn't anything further than that. A couple months later, Dave came back to me and said, oh, actually, we have an opening for a part-time attorney if you want to come do some work for us. And I said, great, let's do it. That part-time position very quickly, within 2 months or so, turned into a full-time position, and here I am.
Fantastic. So just so you guys have a view of different paths from Devon and Brandon, and then I wanted to ask Buddy just to share with us a little bit about the things labor unions do to support social justice work, and what labor unions do to help the whole community, only because not all of us are very familiar with labor unions, and it may not be the first thing we think of when we think about public interest or social justice work.
Actually, unions do a whole lot more for the communities where they're located than they get credit for. The UAW, Local 862, for example, has a great program of helping people in the community. They volunteer a lot of their time. They have a program where they build ramps for to make homes wheelchair accessible for folks around the community. And they engage in a lot of other worthwhile activities. And a lot of unions do that. They perhaps, if they're skilled craftsmen, they'll volunteer their time to work on not for a nonprofit organization. I know the Kling Center in downtown, which provides services to mostly disadvantaged elderly people in the old Louisville community, is sponsored, is supported by a lot of different unions, and a lot of the skilled tradespeople go down there and they will, volunteer to do plumbing or electrical work or, whatever it is that is needed. And, I see what unions do as really just the nature of what they do, and their goal to organize the unorganized, to represent workers on their jobs, to improve their lot, and also to improve the conditions of working people, even if they're not in unions or not represented by unions. They have been strong advocates for so much of the social legislation that has benefited working people, going back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ERISA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and many others. Even though those statutes don't specifically benefit union members, they benefit everybody, still unions are out there fighting for those benefits for everybody. I've heard one person, not many, say that unions shouldn't do this because if they provide good benefits and fairness and other benefits on the job for everybody, there'll be less need for unions. But I've never seen unions take that attitude. They want to go out and improve the lot of working people wherever they can.
Thank you.
And I will say, in representing unions, I always feel good at the end of the day. Almost always. I feel good at the end of the day about what I've done. One of the lawyers in a firm I was in some time ago, left and went to work for a corporation, and in talking to her several years later, in fact, we were talking about perhaps coming back to represent the good guys, she said, well, she thinks about the memories she had, the best memories, the things that really got her going were when she was representing unions and representing workers, rather than when she was representing a corporation. I think you feel at the end of the day, if you've helped somebody retain their job, you feel a whole lot better, you get excited about it. I can't imagine management lawyers going back and celebrating, say, boy, we kept that SOB fired, and don't we feel good about ourselves? I'm a little off topic.
That was fine. That's always good to get a sense for students of whether they'll enjoy the job or not. And then all of our panelists do things outside of their work, although work can obviously blend into your personal life. But I happen to know that Brandon is on the board of the ACLU. And being a sole practitioner, he has to do a lot of networking outside of just his work time. And so I wanted to have Brandon tell us a little bit about the types of things he does outside of work to network and to help with working people's issues.
Well, I think that you never know the value of a network until you're out on your own, or until you're out trying to get your foot in the door somewhere. Like Devon said, sometimes those networks, they come back around in ways that you don't expect them to. My work with the ACLU, by and large, as a board member, is to kind of oversee the ACLU management, by and large, make sure the money's spent well, but also sometimes draw attention to issues that they may not be paying attention to. As you guys know, the ACLU is really, really busy now in the age of Trump. Sorry if I offend anybody. But in the age of Trump, there's a lot of things going on. And then also, if you're in Kentucky, you have Trump and Governor Devon. So there are a lot of issues regarding reproductive rights. There are issues regarding the right to work. There are issues probably all over the map. So what we try to do in the board meetings or as a board member is try to get people who are directly affected by those issues as well, because when you have people who are writing legislation, sometimes they never even met someone who's actually directly affected by what they're writing legislation about. So part of it is just going out there, getting people who have a story to share that can actually make an impact on legislation, can probably present a case which could overturn something. So that's what I do outside of work. It's just kind of being aware and being open to people. Sometimes if you're an attorney, you'd be surprised how many people have a story to share. Even if you can't help them, maybe you can point them in the right direction.
Fantastic. And my final question before I open it up for you all's questions, I wanted to hear from all our panelists because I think this is of great interest to you, and you've heard some points already. Devon talked about the limited license, and we certainly have those externships and clinics available here at Brandeis as well, and most of our students take advantage of those wonderful opportunities. But I wanted to ask them what suggestions they have for what students can do now while you're in law school to increase the likelihood of gaining a legal position advocating for workers' rights. And this could span anything from networking tips to classes to take, potential summer jobs, externships, conferences, and volunteer opportunities. So whatever it is. And I think we'll start down with Chad since he's closest to being a student, and then work our way back to Buddy's perspective as someone who might be hiring students.
So I guess as a student, I can't really tell you how to get a job because I don't have a job. So
what kind of things are you doing to increase your likelihood of getting a job in workers' rights?
So pretty much anything goes on with labor, I pretty much ask Professor Levinson. She is my mentor. The Peggy Browning, pretty much talk with them. They're wonderful people that really help them. The Professional Development Office, they pretty much, essentially Professor Levinson in the OPD office is the people that sent me to the National Workers' Rights Conference and set me up to get the fellowship. So seeing something in the docket, and if you're interested in it, apply for it. You never know. So whatever opportunity is there, go ahead and apply for it and see where it leads you. If there's an event such as this one, or maybe one next week or whatever, I mean, typically there's free food. Just go into it and see what you get out of it. It could be end up your career dream that stem from that event. So really it's just a matter of getting everywhere you can to get as much experience and really see what really interests you. And that's pretty much, and as far as classes, labor law, employment law, arbitration practice, so you got maybe bankruptcy law, just administrative law, and then business organizations. Pretty much covered most of them. But yeah, I mean, pretty much anything that has workers, employees in it, or corporations that you can learn in those classes, they'll be applied. So, that's what we got.
Yes.
Hopefully it works for me.
I would say just keep an open mind. The reason I say that is because I think a lot of times as students you don't realize how long a legal career is. Like I've been doing this for probably 7 years, and I still sometimes think like, well, maybe I'm going to do something different, or maybe I'm going to try something else. Keep an open mind because you never know what one step can take you, or what one direction can take you. In particular, like I started at the Public Defender's Office, and originally, even though I knew in the back of my mind I wanted to return to employment law, I really did like the idea of being a criminal defense practitioner. I like the challenge of it. I like the clients, even though that's a surprise. But you like reaching out to people and actually seeing what you're doing is making a difference in someone's life. So I think that whatever opportunity you get, whether it be a class, a moot court, or whether it be an opportunity that you're not sure will give you exactly what you want, sometimes be open to take the experience, because you can learn a lot just about from everything. So I would encourage you, if you want to do employment law, take labor law, take employment discrimination, take arbitration practice, do arbitration moot court, do trial practice. You'll need all of those skills to start working in the employment field. And then lastly, talk to your friends. I mean, you'll be surprised what they have going on in their own job that you can kind of connect with. So that's what I would advise.
So two pieces of advice. First piece, which is probably not surprising because it's helped me a lot in my career, is to network. Network as much as you can. If you all want to stay in Louisville, start contacting local attorneys. Attorneys, if you haven't figured out by now, just like everybody else, they really love to talk about themselves. So if you email an attorney and say, hey, I'm a third-year law student at Brandeis, and I'm potentially interested in going into bankruptcy law. Do you have a half hour? Can I take you out, buy you a cup of coffee, and let me learn about your practice? Great. Do it once a week if you can. Do it as much as you possibly can. If you want to move, start to try. If you can take a trip for a couple days to wherever you want to move, start to try to do the same thing there, or at least just start making those initial contacts. But the more you can network and start to meet people, the better off you're going to be. And that leads into my second point, which is that you shouldn't be afraid to have someone tell you no. That was a big, I remember when I was a 3L, I went through a phase in my job application day where I thought, oh, I can't apply for this job for this reason. I can't apply for this job for this reason. My grades aren't good enough. I don't want to move to wherever the job may be. Don't let that stop you. If it's clearly a job that you don't want at all, obviously that's a different story. But if it's something where you're just doubting yourself, doubting your capabilities, do not let that stop you, because you never know when that no may turn into a yes, and unless you try initially to do that, you're never going to know.
Well, I second what Brandon and Devon have said. There's not a whole lot left for me to say. They've given, I think, excellent ideas. The one thing I would add, and this is from the point of view of someone who's, from time to time has been in the process of hiring an attorney, and if it's representing unions or even representing individuals in the employment law, one of the things we look for is whether that person has demonstrated an interest in the field. If someone's just looking for a job and they haven't shown any interest in representing unions, representing employees, you wonder, well, they're just looking for a job, but how do we know that they're really going to stick with this? How do we know that this is what they really want to do? And so we look for whether someone has demonstrated some interest in, for example, representing unions. And having a Peggy Browning Fellowship is one strong indication that a person really wants to get into this field of law. So, I would encourage Peggy Browning Fellowships, and as these folks have said, as much networking as you can do. And in networking, you may find that you discover a field that you didn't think you were interested in, but they say, hey, this is kind of interesting. I think I'll pursue that or learn more about it.
Also, I'm going to add, please spell check your emails, spell check your resumes, spell check your applications, because people do pick up on that, and they will turn away an application because you misspelled there and put in a different, the different form of there. That does happen.
So at this point, I want to open it up to your questions. So if you've been sitting here and something has come into your head, which hopefully it has come into many of your heads, now is your time to raise your hand and ask your question. Do we have anybody? Yeah, Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Cutler, you mentioned passing the federal acts versus civil rights act in the ADA. I know that obviously civil rights violations are not eradicated in the workplace, but do you find that there's still a lot of there's still a lot of disability-related incidents in the workplace that lack of compliance, and that pretty much resolve this?
I wouldn't say that it has pretty much resolved itself. I think there are fewer Disability Act cases than there used to be. They're difficult to prove, and I'm not sure what the other reasons are, but we don't see nearly as many of those as other types of cases, civil rights cases.
So, I said one of the reasons the insurance industry working a lot with workers' compensation, but we've seen a lot of employers sponsor bills to make workers' compensation benefits a lot more difficult to see. What are the labor unions doing to oppose that kind of movement? Employees give up a lot of their rights in tort against their employees. Against their employers. With regard to workplace injuries, is there some sort of movement from the labor side to try to reverse that trend?
I'll let you know.
The state AFL-CIO and other unions, of course, lobby in the General Assembly every year. It is now. And one of their focuses is trying to improve the rights of workers under workers' compensation law. In the last couple of sessions, it's been more a matter of trying to fend off attacks on the law rather than trying to make improvements. But no, it's something that unions focus on a whole lot, and something that they lobby for. They try to influence legislation, and there is they work with a group, a couple of groups of plaintiff workers' comp lawyers, including one in our firm, who are also active in trying to improve workers' compensation laws. It's gotten to be, I mean, as you probably know, one of the big issues now is medical benefits, which often exceed the actual payments for weekly disability or for a permanent partial disability. Yeah, unions are quite active in that.
And also not the union organizations necessarily themselves, but individual union members. A lot of times, one of the reasons that unions always get sort of mixed up in this idea of being so political is because a lot of members will go out and actually volunteer for a political campaign, not necessarily associated with the union themselves. And so that's another thing that the union members have done is if there's a particular political candidate that they feel is going to be really strong on a certain issue, such as workers' comp or whatever the issue may be, having those people there to volunteer for the campaigns, to go knock doors, to make phone calls, is incredibly helpful and something that a lot of workers, because they've learned about some of these issues through their workplace, will go out and actually be proactive about.
Other questions?
And just to follow up on that, unions also support candidates who are pro-worker and want to make the right changes, including changes in the workers' compensation law, including Devon's partner, Dave Suholtz, is running for the first time for public office for the state senate.
One of the things that was particularly bothersome to me was that employees would often be highly encouraged to resign their jobs in order to access settlement of their benefits. And with not many
other questions? Any more questions about what they do day to day, or what local organizations they know about, or anything people are interested in? Yeah.
In general, when you're working, would you say you would, the majority of your interactions with the actual, when you're working, what's like a work on case or anything like that? Are you working a lot of times with the employees themselves, or are you working more with the union? How does the day-to-day interactions with them?
Okay, so the question is, are you working more with the entity, the union, or with an individual person? How does it look day to day in terms of who you're working with? Brandon, let's start with you.
I don't practice labor law, but I only work with individuals. So I work with the employee. I always start by saying, okay, tell me everything that happens. Then I try to ask follow-up questions. Obviously, a lot of the work, too, is done in court. So you're dealing with other counsel, too. I mean, you're dealing with management side attorneys who, although they do get a bad rap, they're actually not so difficult to deal with. A lot of times they do understand and they want to protect their client, which is the corporation or the employer, and they can kind of see, okay, this is a situation that needs to be resolved. Or sometimes you don't, I mean, you guys don't see each other's narrative. Sometimes there is that disconnect there. And in that case, you obviously have to turn to court and try to prove your case. So I would say that you do a lot of work with the individual itself, but obviously, you know, it's law. There's always going to be someone representing the other side, even if it's just a corporation themselves.
In our practice, it's pretty mixed. We deal a lot with union officials, union representatives, and we also take, as Buddy had talked about earlier, we also take arbitrations, and an arbitration, as you all probably know from Professor Levinson's wonderful teaching, is generally if an employee is discharged, they're called agreement. So we'll deal specifically with that agreement. And in an arbitration setting, you'll also a lot of times have witnesses that will come forward to speak on behalf of the grievant. So you're also dealing with a lot of other workers at a particular location where the grievant is located. So I feel very lucky because in my job, it's a huge variety of individuals that we interact with on any given day.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is the same. I would say with regard to injured workers who are injured on the job, workers' comp cases, that's almost exclusively just with the individual who was injured rather than with the union representatives.
So I'll just chime in and say, I know for me, when I was in law school, I thought I wanted to do more direct services and something that involved working with individuals very regularly. There are definitely those opportunities in the realm of workers' rights, not only in workers' compensation, but a lot of unions have legal services plans, and those attorneys who work with those clients may be doing immigration, maybe doing family law, any matter of things that they're doing for the union members who are not just a worker, but a person with a complete life. But I would say that what I found when I actually got into practice was my personality wasn't where I wanted to work with individuals who I see for a short time and then I don't see again. So for me to work with an entity, to be with a union, and to have the relationship with the union president and the union officers that lasted over years was much more personally gratifying. And I think that's something you should figure out for yourself, and there's room for both within the context of workers' rights. Did we have another, Mr. Booman?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, how much do you feel like you're activists and how much you feel you're actually working? Like, I mean, if I want to go in this direction, in Germany, but and so my motivation is kind of activist idea. So that's why I'm wondering, like, how do you feel like? Are you working or are you activists?
Tough, good question.
I'll step in.
Devon's going to answer.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I can give an answer too.
That's a really interesting question. So as Buddy already mentioned, I mean, my boss is on the front lines right now. He is actively running for state senate to make a difference for workers, not to give them a plug.
Here,
but
no,
That's not what I'm
Peggy
doing.
Browning and the
But-
University of Louisville do
No.
not endorse any
No,
particular
definitely
candidate.
not. And the only reason I bring him up truly is to say that he has taken kind of the ultimate activist step, and that's what he wanted to do and how he wanted to pivot his practice. So that's kind of one very extreme example of what you can do. Another kind of extreme would be you can be a union side attorney and really just take the cases that are presented to you and do a great job for your clients without getting into the activist piece as much. I think that there can be a lot of overlap, but there doesn't necessarily have to be.
I don't really know if it's an activism. I think for me, it's a situation in which I feel even if the client doesn't get everything they want, I hope at least that the employer thinks twice if presented with a similar situation. So sometimes there'll be cases of like racial discrimination where obviously I only have one plaintiff that has come to me, but obviously there are other people who could be affected by the same treatment. So I hope that even when I bring this issue to the attention of the employer, that they do think twice and say, okay, remember we had that case last time, it became an issue, let's try to handle this differently. So I think part of it is activism, being that you're trying to speak up for others that probably work there as well, but you also just represent your client. So it's a little bit of both sometimes.
I'd say that in representing unions, there are a lot of opportunities for activism, excuse me, if you want to avail yourself of them. But it's generally not required. Because unions are, everybody said it all.
I think they had a question.
Just to add to that, so in my limited 10 weeks that, so unions are, one, they have their own activism, like department, but as something like I said early on, that I wrote a policy to be entered in collective bargaining agreement that is, essentially it's really hasn't been, it's new, it's cutting edge, it's ways to advocate for domestic abuse victims and protect their employment, and it's activism, but you're entering it into the collective bargaining agreement, and that'll be negotiated on, but I wrote it in a way that is both the management side and the employee side, because whether you're a CEO, a manager, supervisor, employee of any sort, you can be a domestic abuse victim. So I wrote it in a way that addresses all spectrum. So that's a way that I was able to act, be an activist. So I mean, essentially, just be creative and you can get it done.
I'm wondering about teachers' unions. My name is JCTA. Is there any difference or a greater challenge to working with teachers' unions than with others?
So this question is whether there's a difference between working with teachers' unions or other unions, and maybe just more generally, are there differences between working with different unions?
Yes. I mean, they're not great differences, but there are certainly differences. The teachers' union, JCTA, is sort of unique in many ways. But I think there is a difference between working with public sector unions generally and private sector unions, because I mean, the tactics you use may be different. The law is different. It's a sort of a different mindset. And so, yeah, there are those differences. Teachers are unique, and they've become sort of a force of their own in recent times. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Public employees have been under attack a lot, and teachers, along with firefighters, teachers are beloved so much, and they have more clout. They're listened. They have more credibility in the public eye than lots of other employees, lots of other public employee unions. And I got to say, this is, as I said, 1992 is the year of the female. I think 2006 17 and 18 is very much the same thing. And they very much speak to those concerns that we see expressed so much of the time in so many areas. And like a lot of professional organizations, teachers have their own, I mean, there's a professional standards board that licenses teachers. So rather than simply having an employment issue, teacher being fired, they may have an issue over their license that goes to a public agency.
Okay, so OPD, Office of Professional Development, we want to thank them for sponsoring and providing lunch. We want to thank the Peggy Browning Fellowship and also the Labor and Employment Law Students Association. And we have some gifts from OPD for our speakers. And if we could give them a great round of applause, they'll be here.